Alrighty then, we're going to get started. We're going to be talking about how to grow tomatoes in the Pacific Northwest, Western Pacific Northwest, because I was corrected on Facebook, rightfully so, because the eastern part of the state has a completely different set. Before we get started, I'd like to share with you some of our, I'm actually going to move this over here, my camera. Okay. If you'd like to see this or any of the other workshops that we've given, please go to our website. You can see the colletscomg.com. And the way you access it, if you just go to our website, is you do the Learn With Us option. And there you can find where our upcoming workshops are, how to connect with the Plant and Insect Clinic, and all the different workshops that we've done. And we've recorded over 88 workshop videos, and if you'd like to, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to be notified by the workshop, okay, alrighty. So if you'd like to sign up to be notified about workshops, please contact Gary at garyf@wsu.edu. So let's get started. Also, any of you who've been to our plant sale over the weekend, we can't express how appreciative we are for you coming, and hope to see you again. I hope you have great success with the tomatoes and other things that you bought, and we're here to help you with that. Now, our summers are late to start this year, maybe a little bit more than usual. Our nights are cold. Some of us live at higher elevations, so we have even cooler conditions just from the outset. We all have a short growing season. I was told when I moved here that summer didn't start until the 4th of July, and I didn't believe them until the first year we lived here. So here's what we're going to be talking about. I didn't add the others at the end here, but we're going to be talking about the tomato choices that you should be making if you want to give your tomatoes a chance to actually become ripe this year or during the season, how and when to get started, how to get a jump start on the season, how to feed and water your tomatoes, and a few problems to watch out for. And after I talk about that, I'm going to share with you how to make a tomato cage, and Nancy's going to show you a really cool way to support your tomatoes by using the Florida weave method. So look at your tomato variety label. It's very important. You want to make sure that you look at the days to maturity. If you're not going to get a ripe tomato. Chances are you're not going to get a ripe tomato if you choose one of those that takes 85 days to mature. So, and the clock starts ticking when you put it into the garden. You also want to check for disease resistance, and that's what these little marks are down here in the corner. You want to know whether it's going to be a vine or if it's going to be a smaller bushy one. Determinant is the bushy type of growth, and the vine then is the taller. But the determinant, the bush varieties, they ripen all at once and then they stop. And this is really great if you're canning, because you've got everything ripe at the same time. Do the canning. However, you don't have, once it stops, you don't have tomatoes then from that plant for the rest of the season. Now, if you have an indeterminate bush, they are tall, they need staking, and they produce all summer, and you'll be able to enjoy your tomatoes far into fall, and in some cases into winter. And you want to know whether or not choose something that your family likes. You'll learn over, with experience what your family enjoys. And another thing, don't plant too much, only plant what you can use. If you're going to preserve things, that's great. If you're not, you'll be like me, and you will have rotting tomatoes in your garden or in your garage, and you can't eat them fast enough. So keep that in mind too. We sold a lot of tomatoes at our plant sale that have short days to maturity. See, like the tumbler was 45 days, and the sweet pea, we didn't sell that one this year, but 62 days. These you will get ripe tomatoes from, probably regardless of where you live here in Western Washington, because they have a chance to ripen. So open pollinated basically means that you'll be able to save the seeds from that tomato because they're genetically stable. The heirlooms are basically open pollinated plants that have been developed, that have been in existence for a long time. Hybrids are those that have been either intentionally or unintentionally crossed. They take the characteristics of something desirable and cross it with the characteristics of a different desirable plant. And then the first crossing of those is sold as an F1 hybrid. And they know that it will be a good cross between the two. However, the bees can do this for you too. But after the first, you can't save seeds from them, because after that first time, it's a luck of the draw. You look at a family with 10 kids and they all look different, and that's what your tomatoes would look like. Okay, so now we're not going to go. I'm going to have to do this myself. Okay, another way to look at it is the kind of tomatoes that we have, beefsteaks, slicers, the paste tomatoes that are plum, and then the smaller cherry fruits. When you bring home your tomatoes or any of your garden plants from the nursery or from us, make sure that you harden them off. They've got this soft little leaf. They aren't used to wind. They're not used to sun. We need to get them used to these kind of conditions. So place them in a dappled sunlight area where they can get a little bit of breeze, or they can get a little bit of sun, and leave them out a little bit longer each day over a period of about a week. If it gets cold at night, like 41, like Gary was talking about, bring them inside or bring them into an unheated garage, something like that, or cover them very close to your house, but I would bring them in. You want them to be able to withstand, sunlight and wind, but there's nothing you can do to help them get used to the cold. So location, this is typical for any garden. The soil has to be fertile and well drained. There's got to be a lot of air circulation around, but not in a windy location. Air circulation in all vegetables, all plants for that matter, helps to reduce fungal infections. Make sure that you irrigate. Make sure you've got irrigation that's close to where you've planted your garden, because if you don't, chances are you're not going to water it well because it's inconvenient. Site selection, you have to have at least 6 hours of sun, although that's the very minimum. More is better. And full afternoon sun, southwest facing from noon to 5 is the best, because that's the warmest and most intense. And if you are trying to get your tomatoes to ripen at a good rate, try to put them with a wall behind them for a little bit extra radiant heat, any kind of a wall. Whether it's a fence or a side of your house. It does not work. Next. Okay, so this is some of the things you can do to help to increase the warmth around your plants. These are bush varieties. These can grow very easily in pots. You can also do vining tomatoes in pots, the indeterminates, but it's a lot harder because they want to grow like crazy. They'll grow to 8 feet if you let them. Some master gardeners in previous years have tried this behind their plants because they didn't have, they live at higher elevations and they didn't have a fence that they could put behind their tomatoes. So they got this, I don't know what this is called, but it's some kind of a building board that's covered with reflective aluminum, or I don't know what it is, but it really created a lot more heat for the tomatoes. The other thing, and I'll be talking about this a little bit later, if you use a silver reflective mulch around plants, it deters aphids, and it also helps to ripen or helps to produce more peppers. You get more peppers if you use a reflective mulch, like those Mylar emergency blankets. But I digress. Okay, so these, for example, are determinate tomatoes that are really good for containers. They don't get really big. Some of them might need stake, but usually not. They only grow to about 3 feet high maximum, and again, they will ripen all at once. But they can be on your deck. They can be on your, move your planter to your driveway where it's usually a lot warmer. Any place to increase the heat. So we were talking about this before we got started. When to plant? The soil temperature should be in the mid 60s, mid 70s. And if you don't know what the soil temperature is, you can get a soil probe that measures temperature. If you don't have one, get your meat thermometer out. One thing, let's see, did I put that in there? The best air temperature is 75 to 85 degrees for tomatoes. And that's why we're trying to build up the temperature with these other reflective surfaces behind them. And temperatures below 57 delay growth and encourage plant disease, which is why we're telling you, please don't plant your gardens now unless you've made some efforts to mitigate the cold. Over 85 degrees, pollination doesn't occur. And if you remember last year during the heat dome, there was probably a 2-week lag after that horrible weekend of plus 110-degree temperatures that we got no new tomatoes. After that, things came back, but nothing pollinated then. Most of the time, the blossoms just fell off. So what does this mean to us in Southwest Washington? It'd be great if you guys could mute your mics. Okay. Basically, this tells us when the last frost is. Basically, it doesn't matter, because if it gets cold one night, even after there's only a 10% chance of there being a frost, a frost condition, you will lose everything if you don't take care of it. So the rule of thumb is delay planting until the 1st or 2nd week of June. You gain nothing if you plant now, unless you take precautions. So to get a jump start on the season, there are a couple things you can do. You can cover your beds with clear plastic or black plastic, and that will warm up the soil beneath them. It'll get it up to temperature pretty quickly within 2 weeks. So if you haven't done that, go outside today and do it. Raised beds warm up a lot, and pots are a lot warmer usually than in-ground gardens. And we talked about heating your soil. And I have a double. There we go. You can also cover your plants, give them some protection. You can heat the air around them like you see in this little close here. That's a fiberglass structure. It'll trap the heat there. You can place water jugs in there. You can spray paint water jugs black, and they will warm up during the day, and then at night they'll help to keep the air warm in that structure. So you can make a cloche, which is basically a tent covered with plastic, and you hold it in place with clips and close it up at night, and that'll help to keep your plants warm too. Wall of waters are really cool things, and that's on the next slide. This is one way somebody's done it. That's just a plastic garbage bag, keeps it warm. So here are some options. This is the cloche I was telling you about. Very easy to do in a raised bed. You just hold the plastic on. And these are wall of waters. They're kind of pricey, but they're wonderful. You just fill them with water, the little cells, place them around your plant, and it keeps them warm during the day. I've heard people have told me that in April they can put these walls of water around them, and they have big tomatoes by the 4th of July. It's an investment. These things are reusable, but if you're one of these really avid, tomato people, you may want to give it a try. And here's their warming solution here. This is row cover fabric around their tomatoes in this case. And here they've created a little wall of warmth around their little plant. This is what I do in my garden. I get a plastic bag, I stick a tomato cage in, which won't stay there. That's just for support, and make a hole in the bottom of it. And during the day, then I plant my plant. And during the day, I leave it down like that because it warms the soil. If I'm expecting 41 degrees, if I'm expecting anything under 55, I pull it up and I pull the drawstrings, and then I go out the next morning when it's warmer and uncover it again. And that helps to protect things too. Your soil, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but the best thing you can do is get a soil test. Those color soil tests, I really don't recommend those. I have only found one article. It's a casual experiment that somebody wrote up in a university blog. It wasn't a research study, and they thought that the rapid test compared favorably to the lab analysis. Chip Google over at OSU doesn't recommend it either. And for the same price, you can send it in and you can get not only the analysis, but you can get recommendations on exactly what you need, because if you put in just guessing what it is, then you won't do it right. What you want to understand, though, is living in Western Washington, we are starting out pretty much with zero nitrogen in the soil because the rain washes it out, unless you've added a lot of compost over the years and you're covering it over the winter with a tarp or something that the rain can't wash it out. But getting the soil test really will save you a lot of money in the long run, and it's environmentally responsible. There's some diseases that plague solanaceous vegetables, which include tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. So you want to rotate your garden like every 3 years, plant beans where your tomatoes were, plant your tomatoes where the beans are, different beds. And you'll be able to look at this later, and you can look rotating your crops. A lot of web places, places on the web have really good descriptions and different ways you can do it. So another thing is, if you compost, add compost. If you use leaves, shredded leaves at the end of the season, cover it with a tarp. Over the years, you're going to build up really good soil, a lot of nitrogen in the soil, and it'll help the soil retain water. And fertilizing, I'm not going to go into that a whole lot. There's a lot of different opinions out there what to do. Chip Bubel from OSU says right at the beginning, you should be adding about 4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 feet, which would 1,000 square feet. And I wrote this down because I'm math challenged. And no, I didn't write it down. I thought I did. So for 100 feet, you would use 1/10 of that. For 32 feet, you would square feet. For one raised bed, you would use like 1/3 of what you use for 100 square feet. Tomatoes are heavy feeders. They do need feeding during the season. And unless you've been adding a lot of organic matter over the years, you're going to need to supplement. Synthetic versus the organics, the plant doesn't know the difference. The only thing is the timing. Organic, it feeds the soil, so it can you feed the soil so it can feed the plants, but it takes time for the microorganisms to break it down so it can be used by the plants. They last longer, but it takes a lot longer to work. Synthetic fertilizers get the nutrition into the plants very quickly, but they leach from the soil pretty quickly too. So if you're smart and you want to use organic fertilizer, put it in now and 2 weeks later plant. Give it at least 2 weeks, and you still might have to jump it up with something that feeds the plants pretty quickly. Okay, you can look at this when we get into, when you look at the slides that we're going to put up online, because we're going to be running out of time here. Make sure that you you fertilize at planting and again at fruit set. And although this says more applications of nitrogen fertilizer aren't recommended after that second time, I have found in my soil that you do. Look at your plant. If it's not producing how you think it's supposed to, if the leaves don't look like they should, nice and green, then you may need to add a little bit more. Don't overdo it or you'll get leafy growth and no tomatoes. You can also do it the easy way and follow the directions on one of the vegetable fertilizers. Okay, let's go on here. How to plant, there are 2 ways to do it. They should be at least 2 feet apart. And the one thing you want to do is strip off all those leaves, all the leaves here, and then bury it up to there, because you're going to get roots on the entire stem. You can do this if you have a raised bed and don't have clay underneath your bed. You can also trench it by doing the same thing, except that you plant it 2 to 3 inches deep. I would go 4 to 5 here. and then just lay it in the trench, and eventually that tomato is going to start to grow straight. And again, make sure you pinch off all the leaves. Watering, water from the bottom. The rule of thumb is 1 inch per week. That's a hard thing to do, but you know what? Better idea, try not to get the leaves wet, because you'll end up with more of a problem with fungal diseases. Water in the morning so that the leaves can dry if you did get them wet. Water deeply and consistently, which means that you want that soil moisture at the root level to be consistently moist. If you let it dry out too much or get it too wet, you can end up with blossom end rot, which I know you've all seen before, and you can end up with cracked fruit. And mulching is extremely important. How much water? Feel the soil down about all the way down to your knuckle on your hand. If it's dry, then water it. If it's not, if it's soggy, you're overwatering. So you should be able to tell with your finger. It should be like the moisture level of a wrung out sponge. Mulch to keep the soil moist, to keep the weeds down, to maintain soil moisture. And you can use clear mulch or black mulch. However, the new one is red. I told people last year I was going to try to use this and I never got around to it, but I'm going to try it. It looks like clear plastic garbage bags, and you put it around the plant at the bottom, and it's supposed to give you a whole lot more tomato production. So pruning. It's about balance. It allows, if you prune some of the leaves, it allows the plant to focus energy on producing fruit. You get bigger fruit. You certainly get better air circulation. It can be easier to support, and boy, oh boy, is it easier to harvest fruit. I don't know if you've ever tried to harvest fruit from one of those that is just kind of all packed in there, and you try to reach in and you can't get it, you know. They mature earlier because they're focusing their energy where they want it, you know, where it should be, and they get a much better yield. So how to prune them? Now this is indeterminate, okay? The vine ones, not the bush ones, the vine ones. So you can prune out the ones in the leaf axils, pinch those out, but you always want to leave this one here, the sucker here in the middle below that first flower. Don't take that out, because that'll you can end up with some leaf problems. So this is an example of an unpruned plant. This is heavily pruned. They took out every single sucker. Lightly pruned, they just took out some. And how you do it is up to you. The first thing I do when I put my plants in the ground after they've grown up a little bit is cut off the bottom ones that are touching the soil. And you're going to have to keep doing that during the season as they grow, because that's a good way to end up with more leaf disease. So should you prune your determinate plant, you know, the bush plant, the one that produces all at once? Probably not. If you're going to, just pinch off the ones that are going to touch the soil, leave everything else alone, because all of the little suckers that pop up are going to produce fruit. So leave those alone. So determinates, probably don't prune, but the indeterminates, you can. That's a sucker, in case you didn't know. That's the finger coming out of the armpit. So make sure that you get all the leaves off the lower part so they're not touching the ground. And that's just showing you another example. Now, can you cut it off? Can you cut the top shoot off? Sure you can. If it gets too tall for you, just cut it off. Remove the terminal shoot when it reaches the top of the trellis, and it will stop growing then. On September 1st, that's the time to do it, end of August, because this is going to help your plant to stop producing blossoms and to concentrate on making fruit, ripening fruit. This is blossom end rot. Remember, we talked about making sure the soil is consistently moist so that the plant will be able to use the calcium that's in the soil. Remove infected leaves or on the plants all season long. Keep your garden clean and watch for different problems like leaf curling, which is usually stress from too much water, too little water, too much cold, too much heat. But if you do see leaf curling, it'll go away. Blossom end rot, we talked about that. Epsom salts, don't use them. You don't need them unless you don't have magnesium in the soil. Most of the time we do. I am not going to go into pests right now, except to say that if you plant plants that attract pollinators and beneficial insects to your garden, like dill and cilantro and sweet alyssum, and you don't spray, or if you do, you spot spray with something relatively benign, relatively non-toxic, these beneficial insects will take care of the problems for you. I haven't had to use insecticides in my garden for years now. And this is a terrible one. This is verticillium wilt. It looks like your plants have been bloach torched. It happens almost overnight, and it can be avoided by not planting tomatoes in the same place year after year after year, because it's a soil-borne fungus. Okay, at the end of August, getting red tomatoes. This is why you're here. Any fruit that hasn't set by then will not ripen. So you may as well stop anything that is getting ready to go. Cut off all blossoms at that point, because any tomatoes that are formed from them aren't going to ripen. Remove most of the leaves, except for the leaves that are covering, that are creating shade for the tomatoes that are left on your plant. And remove, if you start from the bottom up, chances are you're not going to hurt any tomatoes because they don't grow down there. And if very hot weather is protected, keep the leaves or shade the tomatoes with a shade cloth. And the better circulation helps to prevent late blight, which is a terrible disease that can just ruin everything. It'll infect the fruit and the plant. And another quick note, if we're expecting, if it happens, that we end up getting rain toward the end of August and it's forecast, get out there and cover everything with plastic. Because if you don't and the plant gets wet, you're going to end up with late blight. It's in the air, it'll get it, and it'll ruin everything. So make sure that you cover your plant. If we're expecting forecasts late August, September, and your tomatoes haven't ripened. If you do all these things, it focuses the plant's energy on ripening the fruit only, not growing new green growth or putting out new blossoms. Don't water the way you did before, but kind of cut back. You have to be careful. You've got to balance it, because you don't want to end up with blossom end rot. And another way to get red tomatoes is from the vine. And I do this every year because I can't bear to cut off some of them. So I get them into boxes. Although I don't pile them like this, I put them single layers, and I put them in by way of their total ripeness. If they're almost ripe, they go in one box. If they've got a lot of green, some red, they go in another box. And then I put the green ones in another one, and I put them in my garage where it's cool. And that way I can have fresh tomatoes. We had on New Year's Day, we had our last tomato from our harvest. It really does work. So make sure that they're the best ones. Wipe them clean. The tomatoes, the green tomatoes that you should save, should start looking creamy. Not bright green and hard, but they should have that creamy color going from green to a creamy. Clip the stem, don't pull it out, because that opens the fruit up to disease. Place in the open cardboard box, and if it's about 70 or even a little bit cooler, they'll still ripen. Make sure that there's no spoiled fruit as they start to ripen. If you do see it, get it out of the box. In about 14 days, you should have ripe fruit from the ones that are almost ripe. And like I said, if you've got some of the green tomatoes in there and you have them in a place that's probably about 60 degrees, which is what our garage is, they will ripen for you. End of season, shred some leaves and we have a leaf exchange at the end of the season. It's a good idea to go there and get some, run them over with your lawnmower or your shredder, and pack them on top of your soil and cover it with tarp, and that will enrich the soil for the next season. Okay, I'm going to show you how to build, we're doing good for time, I'm surprised. I'm going to show you how to build one of these out of a cattle panel. I love these tomato cages. They are easy to make, They're cheap, they're portable, they're stable, they live forever. They provide access to plants, to the fruit to be able to get it. That was part of my problem with some of the other supports I used. I just couldn't get to the fruit. And storage is easy. You can either, pile them up together. They'll end up being in an L shape, and you can stick them in the corner of your shed. But what I do is, you can see that I've turned them on their sides, and they're holding down the tarps on my raised beds. And that keeps them from getting wet over the winter and all the nitrogen leaching out. And I've got the shredded leaves on my beds, and that helps them to compost in place over the winter. So there's the cattle panel. I'm not going to actually go, I'm going to show you a video on this, but this is just an 8-foot panel. You can use any size you want, but the directions I'm giving you for this are for an 8-foot cattle panel. On the website, I've got the planting, how to cut it and how to fold it. You don't need to see that now. And I'm going to go to a new share. I just learned how to do this. I'm going to go to advanced video, share, open. And this should give a really good video. Can you folks see my video? Yes?
Yes.
Thank you.
We see build a lifetime tomato cage.
That's it. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Here we go. This is 4 minutes long. Before we start cutting, we have to kind of get in our mind's eye how we're going to do this. Each end is going to be the top of the cage. And we are going to cut right along the center here. So we'll have 2 pieces. I've marked those with orange so that we know we'll make the right cut. And we're going to go from there. Here are our supplies. We've got our safety glasses. We've got scissors to cut our zip ties. We have our measuring to measure 25 inches so we'll know where to bend the corners. Magic marker to mark where we're going to make our cuts. And here are the bolt cutters. I've used these before, and you can do it, but it's very difficult. I'm not a very strong woman. I can do it, but it's I don't ever want to try using those again. However, Harbor Freight has some big ones. You've got a little bit more leverage. They cost less than $20. Well worth the money for me. A lot of people have them. You could borrow one. I mean, you only need it for 20 minutes. This just shows you where to cut, where the cuts will be made. And again, this schematic is on the website if you're interested. We're going to start making our cuts now. The other piece of equipment that we need is a board, and there's a couple reasons you need that. This is one of them. And we're going to start here. And we're going to cut each one of these where it's marked orange. Okay, I've made all the cuts. This is the last one. I've made all the cuts, and now what we end up with is 2 separate pieces. These are the 2 halves of our tomato cage. All that remains now is to bend them in half so we have 2 corner pieces, and then we'll attach them. You have to make sure that you're cutting and you're folding it in half. So I've measured 25 inches down. You can see the little marks I put there. And now I'm going to, I had a 1x6 last time. This one is a little bit harder, but you stand on it and you start bending this up. It's going to take you several times to get it the way you want it. That's pretty close. You can make adjustments as you go.
Are you done?
Now that we've made the cuts, we're going to stand it up, and the last thing we need to do is put a couple twist ties, maybe at the top and about 2/3 of the way down, the same on the other side, and you're ready to go. Tomato cage. All that we have left to do is use some zip ties to hold them together.
Wow.
And there you've got your lifetime tomato cage. Snip the zip ties in the fall when you're done. You can reach in, you can grab your tomatoes, you can prune the suckers out of the angles of the tomatoes to give it more airflow. It's very easy to be able to reach your tomatoes and to treat them if you need to. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you end up using this in your garden this year. Thank you. Okay, Nancy, I'm going to bring you back up again. Basic. Nancy's up next. Share. Next. Okay, there you go, Nancy.
So Alice has shown you how to make some great tomato cages, and now I'm going to talk about a different method for supporting your tomatoes called the Florida weave. What is it? Why use it? What equipment is needed? How to do it? And when to do it. Next slide. So what is the Florida weave? It's a trellising technique designed for speed. It's very quick to set up and easy to maintain, and it can be used with both determinates and indeterminates. It's also known as the basket weave or stake and weave training system. And what it does is it essentially sandwiches the plants between two walls of twine so that they are held up.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay. Why would you use the Florida weave? It's a good system for growing many tomato plants in rows. So if you have, I'd say 5 or more tomato plants, it's really something to consider. It requires fewer stakes than if you stake each plant, far fewer, like half. It improves air circulation, holds your plants upright and off the ground, makes it easier to harvest. It's fast and easy to set up, and it's reusable and easy to store between seasons. It's also pretty inexpensive, and sometimes you can use everyday supplies around the yard. Next slide. Okay, why use the Florida weave? Here's my example of why I plan to use it this year. These are pictures of my garden taken from last year, my tomato garden. I had about 30 plants. It looks reasonably okay on July 23rd, the first picture. I used stakes, and I also used some tomato cages, and not the tomato cages that Alice just showed you. Those are far, far nicer than what I had. And then you'll see the second picture is my tomato garden about, it's like 2 weeks later. And those tomatoes grow really, really fast. And what I ended up with was falling stakes, falling vines, falling tomato cages, crowded and pinched tomato stems. I couldn't prune my plants inside the cages. There was very poor air circulation inside those cages. And then on top of that, I had trouble finding and actually accessing the fruit. So the Florida weave looks like it might save me this year. Next slide. What equipment do you need? You need stakes, twine, and optionally a homemade wand. Your stakes need to be strong enough to hold the plants off the ground. They need to have a non-slip surface to grab the twine. And your best options are steel fence T-posts or rebar. You can go with wooden stakes, but the metal stakes are going to be stronger. For twine, the twine needs to resist weathering. It needs to resist stretching, and that is very important. And it needs to bind well to the stakes. And a good option is nylon or polypropylene baler twine. Optionally, you can make a homemade wand, which serves as an extension while you're weaving twine around your tomatoes. It serves as an extension of your arm so that you're doing less bending. And to make that, you can use 12 to 36 inch PVC pipe or a wooden dowel with holes drilled in each end, and you just pull the twine through one end and out the other. Next slide. How do you do it? First, you need to prepare your plants. So before you start, prune them, because once you get that twine in there, it's hard to get to the tomatoes and get them pruned right away. Then plant your tomatoes in a row, leaving 2 feet between each plant. And I said, don't cheat. Mine were probably a little closer and I suffered the consequences. Do not be deceived by those cute little tomato plants. They become huge and heavy. So then drive your stakes into the ground. Drive stakes 12 to 18 inches into the soil between every other plant. And if you need more strength and stability, go down even further. So a stake is typically driven between every 2 plants, but you can do closer. So you can put a stake between each plant, though I don't see that done very much, or further away between every 3 plants, but don't go more than 3 plants. The stakes need to be tall enough for the type of tomato plants you are growing. So keep in mind that if your tomatoes get up to 5 or 6 feet, you also are going to have 1 to 2 feet below the ground. So make sure your stakes are tall enough. Next slide. So how do you do it? So your first stringing should be done approximately 2 inches below the first blossom. And of course, you want to do it when the plants are small and before they fall over. So to create the weave, tie the twine to one end of the stakes about 6 to 8 inches from the ground. And then next, take the twine past the plant or set of plants and pull tightly. You want it to be taut, and wrap around the next stake at the same height. Then repeat this process to the end of the row. And once you get to the end of the row, wrap or tie the twine around that end stake, and now go back the opposite direction. Bring the twine back on the other side of the row, wrapping around each stake, and tie it off again at the end of the row. And there's a diagram on the right that I think is a picture is worth 1,000 words. So there you have how to do it. And in the second diagram, it shows the wand that I mentioned. So then you'll want to add stringings as the plants grow. Each subsequent stringing should be about 6 to 8 inches above the preceding string. Now there are variations on this theme. So you can do a figure 8 between each plant, or most commonly it's done between every 2 plants. And you can have 3 plants between the stakes, but again, it's, you won't have as much strength if you do it that way. Okay, next slide. When to do it? Do it early. I planted my tomatoes last year once they were in the ground. Now, this was my very first time, and I had like 30 tomatoes. But then I went on to do other things. I thought, well, the tomatoes are in. Oh my gosh, they just grew and grew, and I didn't realize it. And by the time I got to them, I was well beyond the point where I should have pruned them. So don't do that. And they were not staked either. They were already falling over. So do this when your plants are 12 to 15 inches tall before they fall over. Do it when the foliage is dry to prevent potential spread of bacterial diseases. And a tip is to remove the suckers from the plant as it grows, and that applies to indeterminates only. to keep your tomatoes from getting out of control. And it also makes them less heavy. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's an example from gardenbetty.com. So there's this is an aerial view of the Florida weave. And the first example is what she does with her determinants or bush tomatoes. And I know that some people say you don't need to support bush tomatoes, but that depends on what you have. Because last year I grew Marglobe determinants, and they were enormous. They were gigantic tomato plants, very heavy, lots of fruit. Anyhow, she weaves around each tomato plant, and it prevents the plants from falling into one another if you do that. And then in the second diagram, what she does for her indeterminates, and that's a more common way of doing the Florida weave, where you're going around every 2 plants, and the figure 8 is made between the stakes. Okay, next slide. So here's an example from a website called fortheloveofgardening.blogspot.com. And I liked it because I thought it did a good job of showing how the Florida's weave is done, how it's initially set up. And in this one, he's weaving between each plant. Next slide. And here are 2 more photos from that same garden. And it shows an individual plant over on the left. And then again, you can see the weaving between each plant. And it looks like, I don't know if those, I think those are heat posts. I'm not exactly sure. Just to prevent failure of this method, because people have had failures, what seems to go wrong mostly is that their stakes are not strong enough, or they use the most common mistake is using the wrong kind of twine. You don't want it to break down. That's why they recommend polypropylene. And that string needs to be very strong, because if you've grown tomatoes before, you know that they can become extremely heavy. And so you have to take into consideration that you might have rain and wind, and that puts a lot of stress on your support system. Okay, I think that is my final slide for how to do the Florida weave.